SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Welcome, my dear students, to a lecture on a room of one's own. What room? Whose room? Are you asking that question? Well, as you know, and you probably should know, is the title of a landmark in feminist writing. Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own, which actually is a collection of two of her lectures which she delivered at women's colleges, two different women's colleges in England, the beginning of the 20th century. You may be surprised to know that there were very few colleges for women in those days. And it is in this context that Virginia Woolf is talking about the importance of having a room of one's own. Virginia Woolf, 1882 to 1941. A woman must have money and a room of one's own if she is to write fiction. So what are we talking about? We are talking about women writers. And what are they writing? They are attempting to write fiction. In order to write fiction, what should you have? According to Virginia Woolf, you must have money and a room. As the lecture progresses, I think it will become very clear to you why she makes a statement like that. Let me introduce you to Virginia Woolf through a group known as the Bloomsbury Group or the Bloomsbury Set. In your earlier semesters, you must have come across the 18th century coffee clubs where people met. Who were these people? They could be writers, artists, critics, dramatists, actors, people who read, people who spoke about issues that mattered. In those days, the coffee clubs were very famous, also called the coffee houses. Remember, I'm talking of Dr. Johnson, and I'm talking of Pope, and I'm talking of the writers of the 18th century. But now, remember, we are talking of the 20th century and the Bloomsbury Group. Why am I mentioning this group? Because Virginia Woolf was a very, very important member of this group. It was an influential group of associated English writers, intellectuals, philosophers, and artists. Some of the best-known members included Virginia Woolf, I've just mentioned, John Maynard Keynes, remember, the great economist, and E.M. Forster, remember, Aspects of a Novel, The Passage to India. Now, Lytton Strachey. Do you remember the Victorian Age? Do you remember the historians of the period? Do you remember the book Eminent Victorians? Well, that is Lytton Strachey. This loose collection of friends and relatives lived, worked, or studied near an area in London. The area was called Bloomsbury. Let's see what Ian Ousby has to say about this group. Although its members denied being a group in any formal sense, they were united by an abiding belief in the importance of the arts. Their works and outlook deeply influenced literature, aesthetics, criticism, and economics, as well as modern attitudes towards feminism, pacifism, and sexuality. And it is to this group that Virginia Woolf belonged. Let me now tell you something about the works of Virginia Woolf. She's written a number of works, but at the moment I'm going to draw your attention to 6 of her important works. So you have Mrs. Dalloway, you have Orlando, To the lighthouse, a room of one's own, the waves flush a biography. I'm sure you have all heard of Mrs. Dalloway, because whenever we talk about the Stream of Consciousness novel, one example that certainly comes to mind is that of Mrs. Dalloway. Well, the story is just one day, and how much of Mrs. Dalloway's life and the people she comes into contact with, and Septimus, etc., is what this novel is about. Orlando, a biography as she calls it, was written in 1928. And you would be surprised to know that this covers 300 years. Can you imagine? The novel is about 300 years in the life of one individual, Orlando. But in the course of these 300 years, he only ages 36 years. And he also changes his gender. That's what Orlando is about. To the Lighthouse is about the Ramsays. Virginia Woolf does something different here too. She's got multiple narrators. The book is divided into 3 parts, and each part is narrated by a different individual. A room of one's own, I'm not going to talk about now. Let's look at the slide again. A room of one's own is what this lecture is about. So I'm not going to talk about it now. The waves. In this book, Virginia Woolf moves out, shall I say moves in, from the outside world into the minds of the characters. Remember, this was going to be an important part of the development of the novel of the 20th century. But it was not completely new, because writers like Fielding had already attempted to do it. So the waves takes us into the minds of her characters. Flush, a biography. My dear students, you'd be surprised to know who Flush is. Flush is actually a dog. And the dog belonged to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Do you remember these Victorian poets? Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Well, Flush is a dog that belonged to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. We could even look at this biography as being a kind of a spoof, kind of parodying the kind of biography that was then written in the Victorian age. So Flush is the name of a dog. Before we go on to looking at some more of the writing and the kinds of views that Virginia Woolf had, I want to draw your attention to a very sad aspect of Virginia Woolf's life. She was mentally depressed, not throughout her life, but at various stages where she had acute depression, and she attempted suicide on more than one occasion. This is what was said about the kind of mental state that she was in. In the manic stage, she was extremely excited. The mind raced, she talked volubly, and at the height of the attack, incoherently. She had delusions and heard voices. She was violent with her nurses. In her third attack, which began in 1914, the stage lasted for several months and ended by her falling into a coma for 2 days. During the depressive stage, all her thoughts and emotions were the exact opposite of what they had been in the manic stage. She was in the depths of melancholia and despair. She scarcely spoke. She refused to eat, refused to believe that she was ill, and insisted that her condition was due to her own guilt. At the height of this stage, she tried to commit suicide. And my dear students, that is how she finally died. She met a watery grave. In fact, she just walked into the sea one day, and her body was found a few days later by a group of children who were playing at the beach. Why did I mention this to you, my dear students? Because I want to show you, I want to tell you, I want you to see that this great writer did have her moments of depression. Manic depression is what I would call it. Let's look at her views on writing, on the female experience, on what she thought about being a woman, what she thought about writing as a woman. The first one would make you smile, but at the same time also makes you a little sad to imagine that women could not probably put their names to their writings because they were not sure whether a woman writing was still acceptable in society at that time. Do you remember George Eliot, The Mill on the Floss? George Eliot was her pen name. Mary Evans Cross was actually a lady who decided to write with a pen name because she wasn't sure if her writings would be accepted. So what does Virginia Woolf say? I would venture to guess that Annan, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. Can you imagine what is ANON? I'm sure you know by now that it is an abbreviated form, a short form of the word anonymous. When you do not know who the writer is, you would find at the bottom of the work Annan. But she says, I would venture to guess that Annan, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. Ironic indeed, the statement is. Lock up your libraries if you like, but there's no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of the mind. I already told you that women were still not going to colleges and universities. As we progress with the book, you will see the kind of restrictions that were laid on women even in the university libraries. Anyway, I'll come to that later. Why are women so much more interesting to men than men are to women? I thought how unpleasant it is to be locked out, and I thought how it is worse perhaps to be locked in. Which is worse, when you find yourself locked out of something, or when you find that you're locked within yourself because you cannot go out? These are, in a way, the feminist Virginia Woolf speaking. And therefore, before I begin looking at the text proper, I'm going to spend some time telling you about feminism. Because remember, I began this lecture by telling you that a room of one's own is a landmark in feminist writing, as important as the slamming of the door by Nora as she walked out in a play. Do you remember the play? Do you remember? Can I give you a minute to tell you who the dramatist was? Well, I'll tell you the dramatist was Ibsen, but I'm not going to tell you the name of the play. It would be interesting for you to cross-check with your classmates and see who knows it. Don't Google for the answer immediately. Pause for a while, rack your brains, and then of course you'll remember that interesting play by Ibsen, not written in English but translated into English and always read as an important feminist work. So, when we talk of a room of one's own, and when we think of Virginia Woolf as a feminist, and when we realize that this is a landmark in feminist writing, I would like to spend a couple of minutes reminding you, helping you to revise your notions, your ideas, your opinions on what feminism actually is. Remember, feminism became popular as a part of literature only in the 1970s. That's just 50 years ago. But what is feminism? Feminism is ensuring that there is a female point of view. We are constantly reminded that most of the novels were written by men. Most literature all over the world, till probably the 18th century or even later, the 19th and the 20th centuries, was written by men. So very often, women believed that no one really knew what they thought. No one really realized that there could be a female point of view. So feminists argue that we should not always be told what men think about women. We should also know what women think about themselves. What is the second point? Look at your slide now. The second point is that women were tired of being the object. Remember, if you are the object, excuse me, if you are the object, somebody else is looking at you. But if you are the subject, you are looking at yourself. Women writers, women thinkers, feminists, the feminist point of view said, we don't want to be the object anymore. We want to be the subject. Another important point of view of the feminists was that we have been pushed to the margins for too long. We now want to hold center stage. The feminists have always believed that let us not imagine that the male is the one and the female is the other. What does that mean? That means the norms are set by the males and the females have to adhere to the norms. Or whatever the male does or thinks is the one way in which it should